Thank you, Avril. Boker Tov, Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov, Kayitz Tov, all those things that are good. This morning's subject is one which I think is something that many people feel very strongly about. And I can see that we have some new faces to the shiur this morning, and welcome to everybody who's not a regular. This particular topic is definitely something which everybody would like to know a little bit more about. I gave this talk, some of you may remember, 6 years ago on the 11th of May 2016. And how do I know that? Because in those days, when Zoom was just a tray for ice lolly, we used to do it in person on a Sunday morning in shul, and I used to record it on my phone and then transfer it to my computer. So I had an opportunity last night to listen to the recording of what I said 6 years ago. And what was really interesting was that the interaction around the table was fierce. There were two particular people who really expressed their opinions very, very strongly. I'm not going to tell you who they are, but some of you may be able to guess who they were. And it was a very interesting discussion. And what was clear around the table was that there was quite a lot of ignorance about the subject, as opposed to speaking from positions of knowledge. And what I'd like to try and do today is to equip you with the knowledge to be able to challenge the anti-Zionist position from a position of knowledge as opposed to a position of ignorance. So, for example, is there anybody here who is anti-climate change? In other words, doesn't believe the accepted wisdom of climate change? Anybody here not believe in climate change? Hands up if you don't believe in climate change. Okay, hands up if you do believe in climate change. Okay, right, I'm going to choose somebody at random. I'm going to choose the person in the top left hand of my screen, happens to be Michael Kraus. Michael, just unmute yourself for a second. And tell me why you're opposed to the views of those who don't believe in climate change.
Because it isn't based on fact. The vast majority of scientists say it is, and my logic also tells me that we're responsible for lots of climate change.
Okay, but are you aware in detail of the anti-climate change people's arguments?
Not really.
Okay.
They just don't believe the scientists, basically. As far as I'm concerned.
So the answer not really is the answer that I wanted. Thank you very much. That wasn't a plant, by the way. That was an honest answer. The answer is not really. And if I were to ask you in the plural, all of you, do you know why the anti-Zionist Jews are anti-Zionist? And I think that the answer would probably also be, well, no, not really. Might have an idea, but not really. So I'm hoping that by the end of this talk this morning, you'll have an idea of why a specific group, and I'm going to be talking about one specific group in detail. We'll mention other groups en passant, but the main group I'm going to be talking about are the ultra-Orthodox Haredi position of anti-Zionism. I'm hoping that by the end of the talk, you'll have an idea of why it is that they are anti-Zionist. And I'll say right from the start that it is my view that the vast majority of Haredim do not know the basis for their anti-Zionism. But by the time we've finished, I'm hoping that you will. So that's the aim of today's session. I want to just mention, really, just to put it to a side, because this is not going to be the main topic, that the anti-Zionism from the left wing, so the left wing BDS type of anti-Zionism is not what I'm going to be talking about today. Maybe that can be the topic for another conversation. It's not something that I am particularly knowledgeable about. It's a political thing and not a religious thing, and therefore I don't profess any particular knowledge. So yes, we know there are the Noam Chomskys of this world. There's a BDS, there's J Street, there's the JLC, all these organizations, these left-wing organizations, and also within Israel as well, Haaretz, for example, which appear to be at best post-Zionist and at worst anti-Zionist. I'm not going to spend time on that group of people, because that's not something that I have any particular expertise or, to be honest, any particular interest in understanding their position any further than I already do. But I do profess some knowledge about the religious side of the anti-Zionism, and I suspect that that's something that I'm able to put over to you, things that you wouldn't already know. Yes, Johnny, you're muted. Johnny, you're muted.
Can you explain anti-Zionism as against anti-Israel, or is there?
Yeah,
what's the difference?
Yes, we will come to it. Will become apparent as we go along. So let's start.
That's one thing, Johnny.
Yes, Ivor.
Can you just first of all define Zionism so we know the baseline?
Yeah, I'm coming right to that in right this moment. That's exactly where I was about to start.
That's what I meant. Thank you.
That's exactly where I was about to start. So, who was the first person to coin the phrase Zionist in the modern term? I don't mean Dion as in our tefillot. I mean the modern term Zionist. Who was the first? Herzl was not the first person to coin that phrase. You would have thought so, and that is the answer that I would have given as well. But it's not the case. Does anybody know the answer to that question? Okay, I will show you a photograph of somebody right now on the share screen. There you go, you can see it now. His name is Nathan Bierenbaum. There he is, rather serious looking gentleman. Nathan Bierenbaum was a very interesting man. He started off life as a Zionist, and he was the first person to use that term. He was born in 1864, died in 1937 at the age of 72. He had a rather colourful life. He started off, he was born in Vienna to a family with roots in Galicia and Hungary. And he studied law and philosophy. And when he was 19, he founded one of the first organizations, Jewish Zionist organizations. I know that Ivor has a big connection to Chovevei Zion, and there was one organization which predated Chovevei Zion, only one, and that was the organization started by Nathan Bierenbaum, and it was called Kadima. It's called Kadima. In 1883, this was the first Jewish student association in Vienna. Number of years before Herzl became the leading spokesman for the Zionist movement. And while he was still a student, Bierenbaum published a periodical and a magazine called Selbstemanzipation, which is German for self-emancipation. And this was the pamphlet in which Bierenbaum, coined the terms Zionist, Zionistic, and Zionism in 1890 and 1892, the term political Zionism. So Bierenbaum's original concept of Zionism was actually a political organization, which the aim of which was to return the Jewish people to living in its ancient homeland. That is the definition of Zionism that we are going to be working with. So the desire, the movement, the enabling of the Jewish people outside of what was then the land of Palestine to return to that land in a political movement and to be self-determining in the land of Palestine, as it was then. That is what our baseline is for Zionism. Now, the first Zionist Congress was in 1897. Of course, the first bunch of people to oppose Zionism were the Bundists. Communists and the Bundists were very anti-Zionist. They saw it as against the principles of Bundism and communism, and Reform Judaism at the time was very anti-Zionist. You will remember, I'm sure, famously, the expression which was said by Abraham Geiger, the father of Reform Judaism: Berlin ist der neue Jerusalem. Berlin is the new Jerusalem. They wanted to do away with all this. They weren't interested in going back to Jerusalem. They wanted Berlin as the center of their world, their Jewish world. And so Reform were in effect the first anti-Zionists. Quite ironic in a way. At that time, the left wing were far more anti-Zionist. Just to go back to Bierenbaum for a moment, in 1912, he became interested in Orthodox Judaism, and he became a fully observant Jew around about 1916. He advocated not for Hebrew to be the language of the Jews, but for Yiddish to be the official language of the Jews. He joined the Agudas Yisrael, and he was a general secretary there. And he ended up his later life very much against political Zionism. And so in a period of 20 to 30 years, he went full circle from being almost the father of Zionism to being anti-Zionist. So that's just a little bit about Bierenbaum. But what I want to spend the rest of our time together today on is the idea of Haredi anti-Zionism, which has its roots in a very obscure manner. If I were to ask you, and I'm going to just ask you to just unmute and shout out one at a time, some ideas as to why you think that the Haredi world is anti-Zionist, given our definition of Zionism. Okay, who wants to be first? Leslie, you've unmuted.
People, Jews who are not Shomer Shabbat in their eyes, anyway.
So in other words, you're saying that their objection is that it is not a state run on Torah values.
Absolutely.
Right.
Okay. Darren.
That you wait for the Mashiach to come and redeem us. You don't do it yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have to wait for Mashiach. It's not for us to do that. We have to sit and wait for Mashiach. When Mashiach comes, Mashiach will bring us back to the land, and until then we have to sit tight and wait. Okay, that's two. Any others? Faye.
Both of them are right. Both of them said exactly what I want to say, but also the fact that it's not the time yet, which is also the Mashiach, and it's not really Israel according to them. It's not Israel as what it is in the Torah. It's just the country.
Okay, so the state is not the biblical land of Israel. Sadly, that's true, and it's not time yet. I suppose that's tied up.
That goes with Sharon, right?
Yeah, that's tied up with the idea that we have to wait for the Mashiach. Any other objections that you think that may have. Ivor, you're unmuted. Have you got something to add?
Okay, as you pointed out, I think the trigger, the catalyst, was in fact the reform movement. Had the emancipation not appeared, then the traditional approach to Judaism and prayer and our yearning for Zion, as in all the prayers, and as we publicly announced, because of our sins, we were driven out of our land, which should be excluded from the tefillot today, in my opinion. But anyway, if that had not happened, people like Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and others who said Toraim derech eretz, they were really trying to protect their status quo from the reform, and I think it bounced.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of the idea that anything that is done by people who are not von unserer, in other words, are not of our type, i.e. are not Haredi, then whatever they do is tainted, and therefore we can't have anything to do with it. And particularly with reform, which is a bit ironic in this regard, because as I said before, reform were actually anti-Zionist to start with. Now, all of those things I think are correct, but the main one, and this is the one where we're going to concentrate most of our thoughts on here, is the concept of having to wait for Mashiach, having to wait until the correct time for us to go back. Now, where does that come from? That is something which we have to understand, because this is the crux of all of their objections to Zionism. The fact that we, the Jewish people, or sections of the Jewish people, took it upon ourselves to return to the land against what they see as the will of God, because we're meant to wait for Mashiach. Now, how do they know that we're meant to wait for Mashiach? Where is the origin? Where is the source of their belief that we have to wait for Mashiach and we can't do it ourselves? Yes, Johnny.
I don't know where the source is, but in the share you gave yesterday, and you believe in the prophet, what prophet was it that said it? That we will return to Zechariah. He said we will return to the land, and God's name's mentioned in that as well. And that's what I believe. Mashiach wasn't mentioned at all in that prophecy.
Correct. Mashiach was not mentioned in that prophecy at all. Rachel, you wanted to say something?
Sorry, I wasn't mute. Yeah, in Malachi, the last prophet says he'll send Eliyahu to announce it.
Okay, so they send Eliyahu to announce it. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. We don't know who Eliyahu is and in what guise Eliyahu will come. But yes, that's fair comments. Rachel, accept that. Yes, Michael?
Could it be something to do with the Jews in the wilderness who actually decided they wanted to go straight back to Israel against the will of God?
Well, they would certainly quote that, but it doesn't answer my question as how do we know what's the will of God? How do we know that we're meant to wait for Mashiach? At that point, Michael, they were told by Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu said very clearly, God said, don't go. And what I'm asking is, where is the source for the belief in this group of people that we have to wait for Mashiach? Okay, so I'm going to...
Johnny, I'm sorry. I mean, you'll shut me off if I go. I don't know how many people know that the Aguda refused to sign the Declaration of Independence, right?
Okay.
They did sign. They signed, and the representative was a Mr. Levenstein, and he gave several reasons as to why they signed. And the whole issue of what signs we have to wait for, that this is the Untitled Chapter, the beginning of the redemption, we have the right to take the land, wasn't even mentioned. The only thing they objected to was that the God's promise to Abraham wasn't mentioned. The Aliyah of Nachmanides and those early Hasidim of the Vilna Gaon, the Baal Shem Tov, who did make Aliyah, They were just upset that there was ignoring the distinct character of the land. There was no mention at all of we do not have the right to take our land.
Okay, now what year was that?
48.
Correct, 48. All right, bear that in mind. Everything that you have said is correct. Bear that in mind, and we will come back to it. So now I'm going to show you where the sources are for their very strongly held belief that we have to wait for Mashiach. And we have to go, and it's not going to be obvious at first, but we have to go to a rather not obscure book of Tanakh, but a lesser known book of Tanakh, a difficult book of Tanakh, and it is called Shir Ha-shirim, the Song of Songs. Okay, Shir Ha-shirim was written by Shlomo HaMelech, and if you read it, you will find it to be a very poignant love story. Shir Ha-shirim is a story of a man and a woman who are deeply in love, and it is the love poem between a man and a woman, and in some places it's rather erotic. It does not mention a God, it does not mention the Jewish people. It is, on the face of it, a simple, or not so simple, a beautiful poem of love between a man and a woman. Physical love as well as emotional love. And just to give you a flavor of this, I'm going to ask Leon to just read the first few verses, maybe the first 3 or 4 verses of chapter 1 of Shir Ha-shirim, and then I'm going to take you to the important parts. But just to give you a flavor of the Song of Songs, Shir Ha-shirim, Leon, first few words, please.
The song that excels, excuse me, the song that excels all songs dedicated to God, him to whom peace belongs. Communicate your innermost wisdom to me again in loving closeness, for your friendship is dearer than all earthly delights. Like the scent of goodly oils is the spreading fame of your great deeds. Your very name is flowing oil. Therefore have nations loved you. Upon perceiving a mere hint that you wished to draw me, we rushed with perfect faith after you into the wilderness. The king brought me into his
Okay, let me stop you there. Let me stop you there. Now, does that sound like a love song to you? No, it doesn't. And the reason for that is that I never thought about this. Leon is reading the Art Scroll translation. Now, the Art Scroll translation has taken the allegoric interpretation by the rabbis of this rather fruity book, Shir Ha-shirim, and made it into a love song or a poetry of faith between God and the Jewish people. That is an interpretation. Now, what the Art Scroll has done is it has not translated the words faithfully, because the words faithfully are a bit fruity. So I am going to read to you the translation of the actual words. Okay. Shir Ha-shirim asher li Shlomo, the Song of Songs which is Solomon's. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Because of the fragrance of your goodly oils, your name is oil poured forth. Therefore the maidens loved you. Draw me, we will run after you. The king brought me to his chambers, his inner chambers. We will rejoice and we'll be glad in you. We will recall your love more fragrant than wine. They have loved you sincerely. I am black but comely. O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not look upon me disdainfully because I am swarthy. for the sun has gazed upon me. My mother's sons were incensed against me and made me a keeper of the vineyards. Tell me, you whom my soul loves, where do you feed? Where do you rest at noon? For why should I be like the one who veils herself besides the flocks of your companions? And it goes on and it talks about the physical attributes. Your cheeks are comely with rose, your neck with necklaces. A bundle of myrrh is my beloved to me. Between my breasts he shall lie. This is a proper love song. You won't find any of that in the art scroll because it's too fruity for them. So they translated it according to the allegory of the rabbis who looked at Shir Ha-shirim and saw the relationship between God and the Jews in Shir Ha-shirim. But the words itself are purely a love song between a man and a woman. Now, bear that in mind. That goes throughout the whole 8 chapters of Shir Ha-shirim. There is no mention of the stuff that Leon just read out. That is an interpretation which Art Scroll has turned into a translation. Those of you who understand Hebrew, look at the Hebrew words and look at the Art Scroll translation, and they bear no resemblance one to the other. So that's very important, that Shir Ha-shirim was written by Shlomo HaMelech on the face of it as a love song between a man and a woman. Now we know Shlomo HaMelech was rather keen on women. He had 1,000 wives and 3,000 concubines. I don't know how he managed, but he did apparently. But it's not out of the question to think that Shlomo HaMelech would write some kind of erotic poetry. The rabbis, of course, saw something deeper, something spiritual in it, and interpreted, and I use that word in a manner of stress, interpreted Shir Ha-shirim in this manner of a beautiful song about a relationship between God and the Jewish people, which is a wonderful thing. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But you'll see where the problem lies in a moment. I want to take you to 3 specific psukim in Shir Ha-shirim. The first one is in chapter 2. I'm going to show it you on the screen. It's chapter 2, verse 7. Let me just show it you on the screen for a moment. Now, this is the verse here, chapter 2, verse 7. Leon, read me your translation, please.
Behold the resting place of him to whom peace belongs.
That doesn't sound right, Leon. Chapter 2, verse 7.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. I adjure you, O nations who are destined to ascend to Jerusalem. For if you violate your oath, you will become as defenseless as gazelles or hinds of the field. If you dare provoke God to hate me or disturb his love for me while he still desires it. Okay, so you heard Leon say there, I adjure you, O nations of who come up to Jerusalem. What was the next bit? For if you violate your oath, you will become as defenseless as gazelles or hinds of the field. If you violate your oath, you will become defenseless as the hinds of the fields and the gazelles. Okay. Now, that's not what it says. Look at the Hebrew and the English translation on the screen. What it actually says, Hishbati etchem, I adjure you, that means I make you promise, I make you make an oath, you must take an oath. Who? Benot Yerushalayim, the daughters of Jerusalem. Doesn't say anything there about nations who will come up to Jerusalem, does it? Benot Yerushalayim. You all know what Benot are. You know what Benot Sherut are. You know what Benot Chayil are. You know what Banot are, daughters of Jerusalem. B'tzivot or ba'ayalot hasadeh. I make you swear, nothing to do with defenselessness. There's nothing that says in that pasuk, you will be defenseless as a gazelle.
It says, I will make you, daughters of Jerusalem, swear by the gazelles or the hinds of the field, okay, in ta'iru, if you will awaken, the in ta'oraru et ha'ava ad shetechpatz. Don't rush, don't waken this love, do not arouse this love ad shetechpatz. Ad, you know the word ad, it means until. Shetechpatz, until you, what's Chafetz Chaim? Chafetz Chaim is the person who desires life. So Chafetz means to desire. So this pasuk here is, I'm making you swear, daughters of Jerusalem, by the hinds of the field and the gazelles, don't rush this love. In other words, this is the man saying to the woman on the simple level of Shir Ha-shirim, don't rush me. I'm not ready to commit to this relationship quite just yet. Take your time. Don't rush it. I swear to you, don't rush it. It needs to be taken slowly. The allegorical interpretation that Leon read out is an interpretation which we will come to shortly about an oath which God is making the Jewish people take. And that oath will become clear in a minute when we look at the Gemara. Okay, that's the first verse. Now, the next verse I want you to look at is chapter 3, verse 5. And it will be very familiar to you because it is exactly the same verse. Bidiuk, exactly the same words. So, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the hinds of the field, that you neither awaken nor arouse the love while it is desirous. In other words, on the simple level, don't rush me. And on the allegorical level, Leon, read it again for us, please.
The verse 5 or the verse 7?
Verse 5 of chapter 3.
I adjure you, O nations who are destined to ascend to Jerusalem. For if you violate your oath, you will become as defenseless as gazelles or hinds of the field. If you dare provoke God to hate me or disturb his love for me while he still desires it.
Complete, I'm not saying nonsense translation, that's not right, but a completely unliteral translation. Doesn't say anything about hatred, nothing. It says what it says on the screen. That is the second oath, okay? That first one was chapter 2, verse 7. The second one is chapter 3, verse 5, the exact same words. And the third one is chapter 8, verse 4. Chapter 8, the last chapter, verse 4, is a third oath, okay? Here's the third oath. I'm going to read it here. Ishbati etchem benot Yerushalayim. It begins in the same way. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem. You have to make a promise. Ma ta'iru u'ma ta'oraru et ahava ad shetechpatz. Why should I awaken and why should you arouse the love until it's desired? In other words, hang on. Don't rush me. Slightly different language, but almost exactly the same. 3 times we have this oath. Now read me your translation, please. Chapter 8, verse 4.
I adjure you, O nations destined to ascend to Jerusalem, for if you violate your oath, you will become defenseless. If you dare provoke God to hate me or disturb his love for me while he still desires it.
Again, not a literal translation at all, completely allegorical. So, what have we got so far? We have 3 oaths, which on the face of it, the words themselves are merely a love song from a man to a woman. They have been interpreted as 3 oaths between God and the Jewish people. Let's accept that interpretation for a moment. Have any of you, any idea what those 3 oaths mean that God has made the Jewish people make? No, I'm not going to waste any time asking you because you won't have a clue, because it's not knowable. It's not something that's obvious there. So therefore, we have to go to an interpretation. So now we're going to an interpretation of Shir Ha-shirim. Are you all with me so far? Give me a nod if you're with me. Okay, so we've got the simple Shir Ha-shirim. We've got the interpretation of Shir Ha-shirim to make it between God and the Jews. And we've got 3 oaths that we don't understand. So if we don't understand the oaths, then we need to find out what they mean. Now, fortunately for us, 1500 years after Shir Ha-shirim was written, Shlomo HaMelech lived around about 1000 BCE. In the year 500 approximately, the Gemara was written. And there is a Gemara which is on the screen for you now in Ketubot. It's just loading. Ketubot, page 111a. And here is a Gemara which explains what these 3 oaths are. Okay? So this is the interpretation of a rather obscure book, Shir Ha-shirim. Let's have a look what the Gemara says. It's on the screen. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see the Gemara's on the screen. Yeah, okay. So I'm not going to say the Hebrew or the Aramaic. I'm just going to look at the English with you. Okay, so we just need to go back up over here. So it talks about these oaths, these 3 oaths. Rabbi Zera says that the oath mentioned in that verse, that's the first oath in chapter 2, means that the Jews should not ascend to Eretz Yisrael, this word here, b'chomah, as a wall. And the helpful Sefaria commentary says, i.e., en masse, whereas individuals may immigrate as they wish. This, according to the Gemara, according to Rabbi Zera in the Gemara, the first oath is a God making the Jews promise that they will not return to the land en masse, until he says so. But individuals can do what they want. Okay. So then the Gemara says, well, what about Rabbi Yehuda? He'd said earlier on something else. So he says, that they're not allowed to go up en masse, that is learned from the second one in chapter 3, the second time it says it. So then the Gemara says, well, what does Rabbi Zera do with that second one? So then we come to this bit here. And the Gemara explains that verse is necessary for that which was taught by Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina. So you can see we've got a machloket here. We've got an argument in the Gemara of what these oaths mean. So Rabbi Yossi, the son of Hanina, said as follows. Why are these 3 oaths needed? Song of Songs 2:7, 3:5, and 8:4. 3 oaths that say exactly the same thing. And we don't understand any of them. Why do we need all 3? Says Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi gives his opinion. And he says, number 1, so that the Jews should not ascend to Eretz Yisrael en masse, only little by little. Number 2, that the Holy One, blessed be He, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, made the Jews promise that they would not rebel against the rule of the nations of the world. That's number 2 promise, according to Rabbi Yossi. And number 3 is nothing to do with us at all in terms of a promise. Number 3 oath is interpreted by Rabbi Yossi that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the nations of the world promise that they would not persecute the Jews excessively. Okay? Now, you're going to ask me, where on earth does Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina, get those 3 oaths from what we read, either my translation, the literal translation, or even Leon's allegorical translation? Where does Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina get that from? He said, well, we have no idea. That's Rabbi Yossi's opinion. There are 3 oaths that say exactly the same thing, and the Gemara has to explain them because we don't understand it. So what we have at the moment, so far, we have got one rabbi's opinion, not unanimous, one rabbi's opinion of an interpretation of Shir Ha-shirim. So we are now 3 steps removed from the original Shir Ha-shirim. All well and good. This is known as the 3 oaths. Okay? 3 oaths. 1, the Jewish people will not immigrate to Israel en masse. Number 2, the Jewish people are not allowed to rebel against the nations of the world. And number 3, the nations of the world are not allowed to subjugate or persecute the Jews excessively. Okay, that's where we've got so far. Now, enter somebody else. In 1960, a person, I nearly said a gentleman then, but I changed my mind. A person who interpreted the Gemara, which is an interpretation of an allegory, of an interpretation of Shir Ha-shirim. So we're now 4 steps away from the original. Shir Ha-shirim is a love song. The rabbis, the ancient rabbis, interpreted it as a relationship between God and the Jews. The Gemara interpreted it as 3 oaths between the Jews and and God. Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina interpreted those oaths to mean no mass immigration, no rebellion against the nations of the world, and the nations of the world can't overly persecute us. And now along comes somebody else and interprets the Gemara, interprets Rabbi Yossi's words. So we are 5 steps in interpretation. We've got Chinese whispers here. Can you see what's happening? Now, who was it that put his 2 penneth within in 1960? Does anybody know before I show you a picture of him? Where's Ivor gone?
Is it Teitelbaum?
Yes. Teitelbaum. Correct, Nachum. Here he is in all his glory. Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. Okay, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, the founder of the dynasty of Saint Mary, otherwise known as Satmar. Okay, Satmar is Saint Mary, Santa Maria, Satmar. There he is, the Grand Rabbi of Satmar, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. Now, what did he do with this Gemara? What he said was that Zionism was, in fact, a violation of all 3 oaths. He says that the Jewish people, against the will of God, broke an oath between God and the Jews by coming back to Israel in 1948. Or before that, of course, with the Zionist movement. He was opposed to the Zionist movement because, number 1 oath, the Jews are not allowed to immigrate en masse. Number 2, he said, we cannot rebel against the nations of the world. We're only allowed to go into Israel when the nations stand back and allow us in and give us permission to go in. We're not allowed to rebel against the nations, and we have to suffer our persecution because God has promised us the nations will not excessively persecute us. He interpreted that, he interpreted Zionism as a violation of all of those oaths. Okay, so this is not the 3 oaths, and he wrote this in a book which was printed, published in 1960, 1961. And the name of the book was called, does anybody know the name of the book?
No.
Hazel, do you know the name of the book?
No, I don't.
It's called Vayoel Moshe. Vayoel Moshe. I need to just take him off the screen. He's disturbing me. Vayoel Moshe. Okay. Now, where does that name come from? That name comes from, Leon, I forgot to tell you to get this ready, please. Shemot, chapter 2. Vayoel Moshe. Now, this is a play on words, this name of this book. His name was Yoel Teitelbaum. His grandfather was called Moshe Teitelbaum. There is a pasuk in the Torah, in Parashat Shemot. It's chapter 2. And it is, I've forgotten what verse it is now. If you just give me a second, I'll find it. 21. There it is on the screen. Verse 21, Leon, please.
Moses desired to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses.
What are we talking about here? We're talking about Moshe living with Yitro. Living with Yitro. Sorry, let's turn that off. Moshe living with Yitro. Look at the words here in Hebrew. Vayoel Moshe lashevet et haish. Vayoel, it's a play on words. He agreed, Moshe agreed, but there's also, Allah is also a word for an oath. It's also a Hebrew word for an oath, Allah.
What's on the screen yet, Johnny? You're not screen shared it.
Oh, have I not screen shared it? Sorry, let me show it you. Thank you, Johnny. Tell me when you've got it, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, there it is where my pointer is. Vayoel Moshe. Moshe agreed or consented to stay with the man, meaning Yitro. This is a play on words because Yoel Teitelbaum, Ben Moshe was his grandfather. He agreed that we should stay. Where was Moshe? As an outsider. He was an outsider with Yitro. He did. Where was his people? His people were in Egypt. Vayoel Moshe. He chose this book because he was implying very strongly that we should not be returning. We should be agreeing to stay with the man, to stay with the nations. And within this book, Vayoel Moshe, which was published in 1960, there is a whole treatise on the three oaths. One whole section of the book is dedicated to the three oaths. And the bottom line is that Zionism is the greatest sin of all time, according to Teitelbaum. Not only that, he was the one that said, Mipnei chatoenu, because of our sins, he blamed the Holocaust. Meforash, he blamed the Holocaust publicly, plainly, and clearly on the sin of Zionism. Because of the sin of Zionism, God's anger was kindled and he brought the Holocaust. That is his view. His view, as you know, there is a concept of v'chai b'hem. We spoke about it in one of our shiurim very recently. I can't remember which one now. That the mitzvot are meant to be lived by. There's only 3 mitzvot that you have to give up your life for. Do you know what they are? Murder, avodah zarah, idol worship, and sexual immorality. According to Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, there is a 4th one that you have to give up your life for, and that is if you are asked to draft into the Israeli army. Okay, so that is his degree of anti-Zionism, and it's based on a 5-handed interpretation, Chinese whispers, of Shir Ha-shirim. Now, the first thing that we would say in response to that, because just as really, if we're honest, Michael Krauss and none of us can really have an opinion on climate change because we don't know the science. Maybe he does, I don't. We don't really know the science. We don't really know what they base their arguments on. We don't really know what the anti-climate changers base their arguments on. It just doesn't feel right to us that what they say, okay? But we don't really know. So in all truth, until we have studied both sides of the argument, we oughtn't to give an opinion. 1 second, Leon, I'll come to you in a sec. Now that we know, by the way, if you were to ask, I reckon, if you were to ask, 90% of the Haredim would not know that their opposition to Zionism is based on the 3 oaths. And if they did know it was based on the 3 oaths, I very much doubt that they could quote to you the psukim of the 3 oaths and what those psukim actually meant. But the Rebbe says it, so the Rebbe says it must be right. We now know, having gone through the process of understanding where Shir Ha-shirim ended up with Teitelbaum's opinion on the 3 oaths, that Zionism is the greatest sin of mankind. Now we can look at it properly and give the pro-Zionist response to their argument. Because it's no good us just saying, well, your argument's a load of rubbish. We have to be able to dissect their argument and show them that actually it's wrong, it's misguided, and it's incorrect. And that's going to be the next part of what I'm going to talk about. But Leon wants to say something first. Yes, Leon.
Does Teitelbaum not distinguish the second of the swear the oath, the second oath, by saying that at least the nations have stood back and said, okay, you can go. In 1947, the United Nations passed that resolution.
Correct. And we're going to mention that right now, Leon. The simple answer to your question is no, he does not accept that, but that's what we're going to talk about right now. Okay? So the response, the pro-Zionist response to the approach of the 3 oaths is as follows. Number 1, the Gemara here is talking about an interpretation of psukim in Shir Ha-shirim. Now, you may know, some of you may know, that the Gemara is split into 2 sections. There is a halachic section, whereby we learn halacha, and then there are the Agadic sections, some the same word as Haggadah, the stories sections. And it is an accepted concept amongst many of the Rishonim, the early commentators, Ramban particularly, also Rambam, Nachmanides and Maimonides, that when in terms of halachic points, the Gemara cannot be trumped. We have to accept what the Gemara says in terms of halacha. Agadah, on the other hand, is not necessarily to be taken as literal and not to be necessarily taken as immutable and mandatory. And that is a very clear approach from the Ramban. Ramban writes very clearly that in issues of halacha, we cannot argue with the Gemara, but in non-halachic matters, we do not have to accept it as literal. Rambam, Maimonides himself, says that the 3 oaths are not a halachic requirement. That's number 1. So the pro-Zionist approach is your 3 oaths don't even get off the ground because they are not mandatory. You want to interpret them like that, that's your lookout. That's your problem. But it is not mandatory for this Gemara to be accepted as halacha, as you are saying. That's number 1. Number 2, and this is the point that Leon made. Let's take each of the 3 oaths in turn. Oath number 1 was the Jewish people are not allowed to return to Israel en masse. Did we return en masse? No. Even today, 74 years after the State of Israel was declared, we are still a minority of Jews in the world living here. Not far off it now. We're about 48% or something like that, I think. But you could by no means say that all the Jewish people have returned to the land at once, which is what the oath says. You shall not go en masse like a wall. We didn't go like a wall. We had to come in dribble by dribble, right? We weren't allowed in. The only en masse we got was after the Soviets fell, and we had a rush, but even that was not en masse, as it were, the whole of the Jewish people. We're still not there. So we haven't, even if we accept your three oaths, which we don't, but even if we do, we have not violated oath number one, because we have not come in en masse. We have come in little by little, exactly as we're allowed to do. Number two oath, which we don't accept, but let's say, you're not allowed to rebel against the nations of the world. This is what I was speaking about yesterday. In 1947, November the 29th, there was a miraculous vote in the United Nations. It was a time when East and West were at loggerheads with one another. They wouldn't agree on what day it was. And yet they had a 2/3 majority for partition of Palestine for a Jewish state. Okay, that was as near as anybody could possibly get to the nations of the world allowing us to go in. The United Nations represented the nations of the world. Your argument, Leon, or your suggestion that Teitelbaum's argument is it wasn't unanimous. As far as he's concerned, it would have to be unanimous to be not violating the oath. But I think any normal human being would say that the United Nations partition plan, which was voted for on a 2/3 majority on the 29th of November 1947, gave permission to the Jews to have a Jewish state. We were not rebelling against the nations of the world. We defended ourselves when the nations around us attacked us on the 5th of May, but we did not rebel against the nations of the world. That's oath number two, which we haven't violated. And finally, we would say, what was oath number three? God promised us, made the nations of the world promise that they would not excessively persecute the Jews. Is there any human being in the world who can say that the Holocaust was not an excessive persecution of the Jews? That oath has been broken. And so if that oath has been broken, then the other two are no longer valid anyway. So first of all, we don't accept them as halacha. Secondly, we have not violated the two oaths that we made. And thirdly, the third oath, whether it be violated by God himself or violated by the nations of the world, has made the other two irrelevant. So that's number three oath out of the window. So the Zionist approach to the anti-Zionist theory of the three oaths is, number one, it's not halachically binding. Number two, we haven't broken any of those oaths. And number three, even if they were halachically binding, they have been unbound by the fact that the third one was so bitterly and disastrously and utterly broken by the nations of the world. So those are the responses that we have to the anti-Zionist approach. We now have a summary so far. Shir Ha-shirim is a love song written by Shlomo HaMelech, interpreted by the rabbis of old as being a poem of love for God to the Jewish people and reciprocated. That was interpreted by the Gemara, had to explain why there are 3 psukim almost identical. 2 are identical and the third one's almost identical. 3 oaths that seem to say exactly the same thing. One opinion in the Gemara, Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina, gives an opinion that that represents 3 oaths, which seemingly have no connection to what he says, but those are the 3 oaths that he said. His interpretation in an Agadic Gemara, one interpretation of an Agadic Gemara of an interpretation of an interpretation, and then Yoel Teitelbaum's grabbing hold of this Gemara and interpreting it again to show that Zionism is the worst sin that could possibly be, so much so that Yaharog va'al Yavor, you have to give up your life rather than be a Zionist. So that's their position. Our position as a pro-Zionist is that it's not halacha, it's an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation, and we don't accept that interpretation. It's not halachically binding, and anyway, we haven't broken those oaths, and anyway, the oaths are now invalid because the third one was broken. So that's the response to that. The response to the response. So what would the anti-Zionists say? They would say that although the oaths are agadah, there is a precedent that some agadah is halacha, and they would say that the Ramban and the Rambam don't necessarily agree that, even though there is something called the Rambam wrote. Very interesting. This the Rambam sits on the fence a bit. This is Maimonides. He wrote a very famous treatise called the Epistle of Yemen, Igeret Ateimani. And in that, he's writing words of encouragement to the Yemenites. And he says, don't worry, your time will come. You just have to be patient. Now is not the time. He does not bring that opinion that you have to wait to go to Eretz Israel in Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah is his magnum opus of halacha. He only brings that in a letter of encouragement to the Yemenite Jews, and it's very telling that he doesn't speak about that in Mishnah Torah. So that's another point. Now, the third thing, and I'm going to finish with this now. The third thing is that somebody mentioned right at the beginning, I think it was Sharon, said that one of the reasons that they are anti-Zionist is that we have to wait for Mashiach. So that raises the question of what or who or when is Mashiach. Now, there are, somebody else mentioned that we have to wait. I think it might have been Charlotte mentioned the prophecy in Micha that says, not Micha, sorry, Malachi, who says that we will have Eliyahu Navi will come and herald the Mashiach. The Mashiach will come in on a white donkey into Jerusalem. Last week in the Tanakh Shiur, we mentioned General Allenby. General Allenby was a scholar, and he knew of these words of Tanakh. So Mashiach is going to come in on a white donkey. So there are people out there who are literally waiting for a person to ride into Jerusalem on a white donkey and declare himself as Mashiach. The last person to do that was Shabtai Tzvi, and it didn't really end very well. There is a concept in the Rambam, in Maimonides, that Mashiach is not necessarily a person. Mashiach is a concept, a time period when certain things will happen. According to the Rambam, there are three criteria that must be fulfilled before we can know that we are in the time of Mashiach. Number one, there has to be the ingathering of the exiles, kibbutz galuyot. We spoke about this yesterday in the shiur. Nobody can say that has not begun at least and taken powerful strides towards the end of kibbutz galuyot. the ingathering of the exiles. The second criteria of the Rambam is that we should have sovereignty over this land. We have sovereignty over this land for the first time in thousands of years. And the third criterion we have not yet fulfilled, and that is the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, there are those who believe that that third criterion should have and could have been fulfilled in a 24-hour period between the 5th and the 7th of June 1967, when we had that famous grainy pictures, we've all seen it, Har HaBayit Biyadenu. There's a very famous, well-known story of Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who was the rabbi of the IDF, chief rabbi of the IDF at the time. Mordechai Gur was the commander who took Har HaBayit, who took Temple Mount. Rabbi Goren wanted him to blow up the Golden Dome and start rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash there and then. And he kept pressing him to do it. And Gur said to him, if you say that one more time, I'll slap you in prison. So there are those who believe that that opportunity for rebuilding the temple was there for a short period of time and that we missed the boat. Be that what it may, be that as it may, there are many people who believe, I happen to be one of them, that Rav Kook was another one of them, who believes that Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, the time of Mashiach, Mashiach is not a person who's going to come riding in on a white donkey or in a white Rolls Royce or a Tesla or whatever. This is a time period. This is a period of miracles when the ingathering of the exiles will occur, when Jews will be sovereign in their land, and they will have an opportunity, whether they take it or not, is another story, to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. I personally believe we are living in the times of Mashiach. So my view is, if you guys over there are waiting for Mashiach before you come back to Israel, I think you'll be waiting for a very long time, because he's already here. This is the time of Mashiach. We're living it. And that is why we are Zionists. And now you can go and discuss why you don't accept their anti-Zionism, because now you understand their reasoning for anti-Zionism. Not because the government of Israel is not Shomer Shabbat, and not because the government of Israel is anti-Haredi, which it may well be, and not because there are certain places in the industrial state here that sell pork. None of that is anything to do with the fact that Jews have returned to their land. Jews living in their land didn't always keep 613 mitzvot. In fact, there's more Torah being learned today in the land of Israel than ever before. There are more mitzvot being kept in the land of Israel today than ever before in the whole of history. So don't accept any guff that anti-Zionism is because of the government of Israel. Anti-Zionism is based on Teitelbaum's interpretation of the Gemara in Ketubot, which is an interpretation of the three oaths, which is an interpretation of the rabbis of a love song written by Shlomo HaMelech. Any questions?
Johnny?
Yes, Ivor.
Yeah. This Teitelbaum is sickening. What's also very upsetting, this was our Achilles heel, not the Aguda, and certainly even the Mizrahi did not attack him. The sad thing is, and we saw this also when these Meshuggahs went to see Khomeini, the Notorious Carter, because of their dress and their appearance, they were considered by liberal Jews as the ultimate Yid. This is a terrible thing we have to undo. This is a mental switch.
Correct. Personally, this is one of the things that I have incredibly strong views about. It was very interesting because when I did this talk 6 years ago, as I told you earlier on, I listened to it last night so that I could refresh my memory on everything. I was much less forthright than I have been today. I said everything I've said today, but in a much, a bit more sitting on the fence sort of approach. I'm sick of sitting on the fence. I feel incredibly strongly about this. Yeah. And personally, my own view, I'm a very inclusivistic person. I'm happy to accept anybody into my camp, but I want a divorce from that opinion and that approach. If you want to read about Teitelbaum, go on the Wikipedia page. It's not pleasant reading. And the problem is, as you've said, Ivor, is that in the eyes of the non-Jewish world and in the eyes of the secular world, all religious Jews are lumped together. Yeah. In the same way as in the Orthodox eyes, all non-secular Jews are lumped together, whether they be conservative, reform, modern Orthodox, whatever, traditional, they're all the same. They're all goyim, whatever way you look at them. The other thing is true as well. All Orthodox Jews are tarred with the same brush. And again, as you say, because they are so visibly obvious and identifiable, that is what we have to live with. And we need to make, when I say we, I'm talking about the modern Orthodox world now. I feel that we have to make a stand to make it very clear that this is not our group of people. That's my very strong view. Sharon has her hand up patiently.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, and thank you for that, Johnny. Particularly in light of Israel Apartheid Week's results in campuses throughout the world, from Melbourne to Harvard University, but this is a different part of the topic. Two things. One, the one opinion in the first vow that was done in 500 CE. What were the political conditions under which that commentator, that rabbi, made his statement, and why does nobody take a look at the historical timeline in which these things come from, and the reason why this issue was raised? I mean, there are enough issues to raise that they didn't have to raise that unless it was answering a question for them in 500 CE where he lived. Secondly, and on a completely different topic, is Chabad, which, you know, has the whole uniform and has many different faces and facets, depending on to whom their faces and facets are turned. They write, or at least their Rebbe wrote a great deal about the internal galut, that each person's soul is exiled from God, and that what our job to do is, that exile is the spiritual exile more than the national or political exile. And yet Chabad is quite Zionist and has a strong presence in Israel. Can you discuss a little bit around the sociology and theology of Chabad, please?
Okay. Two very important points. I'll take them one at a time. The first point of historical context of the Gemara is, of course, absolutely vital. As you all know, those of you who are regulars will know that historical context is a phrase which comes up over and over again in our Hashirim, because without historical context, you can't understand anything properly at all. And so I'm grateful to Sharon for raising that. The historical context here is that these rabbis were under the rule of the Romans. Although it was written down in around 500, the various rabbis of the Gemara and of the Mishnah are ranging in that period from the Mishnaic era, so just before the destruction of the temple, to the Amoraic era when the Gemara was written. So it's a period of at the turn of the Sphira to around about 300-400 CE. Now they were under the rule of the Romans. They were for sure. They were subjugated. They were not allowed to be sovereign in their own land. And they certainly were not allowed to rebel against the nations. And if they did rebel against the nations, they got severely punished. So, of course, the historical context there is very important. And that is something that is correct that Sharon has raised that. And we need to bear that in mind, of course, when we interpret that. And again, I use this word interpret over and over again because there is a big danger of turning, and this is what's happened, of turning interpretation into fact and fact into what we call Torah Misinai. In other words, the words of God. So much so that Teitelbaum says you have to give up your life rather than draft into the Israeli army. I mean, you know, it actually beggars belief. And that's what happens when you turn interpretation into fact. The interpretation has historical context. We're in a different historical context. That interpretation is not necessarily valid for our generation. So that's point number one. Now, point number two, Chabad is a whole story in itself. You're quite right that Chabad is not anti-Zionist. It has been very careful, Chabad, to tread a rather what I would call parav line towards Zionism. The Rebbe himself was certainly very in favor of people going to live in Israel. He himself did not go and live in Israel. One of the reasons he gave for that was that if he ever came to live in Israel, he would never be allowed to leave, because once you've gone into Israel, it's forbidden to leave Israel. So Chabad certainly have engaged with Israeli society in a very positive way. And they are not, certainly not connected with Satmar. If there's anybody who approaches the hatred that Satmar has for Zionism, it's Chabad. I would say that Satmar's hatred for Chabad is only surpassed by its hatred for Zionism. You know, my enemy's enemy is my friend. Chabad takes a rather parav line towards Zionism. It's not anti, it's not especially pro either, but it's a very pragmatic organization, and its role in the world has been set for itself to accept and to bring closer every single Jew of whatever flavor that, if you like. Chabad accepts absolutely everybody, and they do it very successfully in many, many places, including the land of Israel. So on that score, I think Chabad cannot be criticized, and certainly is not in this camp that we have been talking about just now. Who had Rachel, and there was somebody else before that. I can't remember who it was. It was Johnny. Johnny first, and then Rachel, please. Johnny, you're muted.
There are Satmars living in Israel as a community here.
There are Satmars who live in Israel.
I don't think he's been here. Has he been here, Rabbi Teitelbaum?
Rabbi
Mr. Teitelbaum.
Did he come to Israel? He did come to Israel. But he didn't stay in Israel, and
to get his money.
There are Satmar communities here, and I suppose to give some of them credit, at least, there are some of them that do not take any money from the government, who refuse to take benefits, etc., etc. However, they still benefit from the roads and the police and the protection and the water system, etc., etc. But there are Satmar communities who live here. They don't have a problem with individuals coming to live in Israel. It's the concept of the Jews returning to Israel. They believe that we should live in the land of Israel under the rule of somebody else. Don't really care who it is, British, Ottoman, Palestinian, they don't care as long as it's not Jew. Okay, it's not the individuals that they object to, it's the concept of en masse immigration. That oath number one. Rachel, and then David. Rachel.
I don't know how much of their opinion has been reinforced by the fact that the early Zionists came from some of them from communist background, and I think that idea was reinforcing the fact that it's wrong.
I think you're right.
I think a lot of the modern, not modern Orthodox, but the people who live in Israel now who are Orthodox don't know anything about those three swears and don't really go with Satmar. But I think they just look at the present, right through the governments of Israel, which were completely secular, and the way that Israel is sort of going, and they object to that.
There is a big difference, Rachel, between accepting that we should have a Jewish state and not liking the type of Jewish state that we have at the
We
moment.
have. Mm.
No, but I think that their opinion was reinforced over the century.
Okay,
Last century.
that may well be. And somebody mentioned early on the fact that it was I think it was Ivor, that it was a reaction to reform. It was certainly a reaction in the first place. It was certainly a reaction to people like Herzl, who were clearly not religious, and all the early Zionists were not religious. And therefore, you know, like we've said before, nicht von unserer, so we have nothing to do with it. But the real anti-Zionist, and I'm not talking about anti-government, you know, none of us here love everything about every government that they've ever had. That's not the point. The point is that we're discussing is not whether the successive governments of Israel have had correct policies or not. The question is, should there be a government of Israel? Should there be an Israel in the first place? That is the thing that you're quite right. They don't know about the three oaths, and they jolly well should know about the three oaths, because that when they're saying, you know, you lived in Manchester for long enough to know that, and you'll have had the same experience as me, that they wouldn't even use the word Israel, right? Where will you be for Yom Tov? I'll be in Eretz Yisrael, right? What do they say for the prayer on a Shabbat morning? Misha Berach Aveseinu Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov Hu Yivarech Es Yoshvei Eretz Yisrael. Don't mention Medinat Yisrael, Chas v'Chalila. The concept of a state of Israel, forget the governments, that's just an excuse. That's just the cherry on the top, if you like. Fine, you don't like the government? Fine, let's get a better government. But you agree that we should have a government, we should have a Jewish government. No, they don't. Medinat Yisrael is not acceptable because of the oaths. It's Yoshvei Eretz Yisrael. That's who they'll bless, the people that live there, not the state. So anybody that says to you that they are anti-Zionist because they don't like the policies of successive governments is deluding you and themselves, because that's not a reason. I don't happen to like Jeremy Corbyn's politics. Doesn't mean I don't believe Britain shouldn't be allowed to exist as a sovereign nation if he becomes prime minister. Get rid of him if you don't like of it. You don't say they don't have a right to have a sovereign land. The two things are completely separate. They've been mixed up in people's minds, but they're two completely and utterly separate things. And the anti-Zionism per se is based on the three oaths, and as we've, I think, demonstrated quite starkly today, interpretation of interpretation of interpretation of interpretation. David Marks.
Yeah, interpretation of interpretation. Can we look at the sources and the context of the sources, and let me state from the outset that my views are very similar to Ivor's views, so I've got no support for the Haredim here. Just one quick point there. Find me a Chabad shul anywhere in the world that will say Tefillah for Medinat Yisrael. You won't. Okay, so you're critical of the art scroll, in particular's commentary to Shir Ha-shirim. Bear in mind that Shir Ha-shirim was one of the Sefarim that was hugely debated as to whether it was going to get into the canon or not. And the very earliest sources, the earliest commentaries, like the Targum, like Rabbi Akiva, so all very, very early sources say that the only reason that it's in the canon is because it has to be interpreted allegorically for Hashem's love for Yisrael. Had it been treated literally, it would never have got into Tanakh in the first place. Secondly, as far as context,
let me just stop you there, David,
yeah,
because I'll forget the first point if you go on to your second one.
Okay.
And you're absolutely right. And I believe that that is even more powerful evidence for my position, because it wasn't even agreed that this should be in the canon in the first place. There were many rabbis, as you pointed out, that thought it was a dirty book and it should not go anywhere near the canon, right? So then...
and you got Rabbi Akiva who says Kodesh Kadoshim.
Correct. So you know, it's interpretation, and so I view the anti-Zionist argument based on the three oaths like a 5-story building that is built on no foundations, and it will just fall down if you give it a little push, because the foundations are faulty. The whole thing the whole premise of it doesn't even start, because it's an interpretation which wasn't accepted even by all the Anshe Knesset Agdola, and then the interpretation wasn't accepted by everybody, and etc. And then we don't need to go through it again. Yes, David, your second point, please.
Okay, the context of the Gemara in Kesubos that you quoted. Again, I've never learned this Gemara, but I pulled out the art scroll whilst I was listening to you. And the Gemara, the context of the Gemara there is a halachic discussion on the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, which, according to everyone, is a mitzvah incumbent upon everyone for various reasons. You can't do Tariag mitzvahs if you don't live in Eretz Yisrael, etc., etc. And the Gemara discusses a statement in the Mishnah about whether the head of the household can force his whole family to make Aliyah. And there are a number of pages to look at. Some of the points that you've raised in your lecture this morning is actually found in some of the comments that Art Scroll makes. I think it'd be very interesting in another time to study this Gemara in depth, both with Art Scroll and Rabbi Steinsaltz, who you certainly couldn't accuse of being anti-Zionist, to see what we get out of it. But it does appear to me, from a very brief reading, that the conclusion of the Gemara is that individuals there's no problem in them making Aliyah, but mass Aliyah seem to be forbidden, and we find this even up to the time of the Maharam, that this was his Pesach as well, 500 years before Teitelbaum.
So yes, I'd like to learn those Gemaras. I think we have to finish Sanhedrin first, so we're probably looking at about the 53rd century, David, before we'll get to that, but maybe we can do that at another time.
Which book of the Gemara was that?
Ketubot, Nachum, and it's Ketubot, page 111A.
Thank you.
Ketubot 111A. I'm afraid I'm going to have to go very shortly, so I'm just going to take Sharon's got her hand up. We'll just take Sharon's last comment, and then I'm going to have to call it a halt. Happy to do another session at any time if anybody's interested. Sharon.
Yeah, I'm a little confused. This is about the Satmar lineage. Are almost all Haredi courts and lineages subscribing to Teitelbaum's point of view, or should we not paint them all with the same brush?
Okay, good question.
Because it's important. You know, you end up with prejudging people. The second thing is, has Rav Kook or any of his followers addressed this line of reasoning in terms of Zionism, taking them on, on their own premises? Two questions.
Yeah. Okay. So the second one first. Yes. Basically, the response to that I put forward to you is based on the modern Orthodox approach initiated by Rav Kook. So there are many. I mean, I didn't make it all up. I am not clever enough to make all that up. I had to. That comes from various modern Orthodox rabbis' writings. And the first question is, the truth is that the vast majority of Haredim are anti-Zionist, and they don't know why they are anti-Zionist. Only Satmar, and probably only a section of Satmar, and the Turi Carta is one of them, really understand why they are anti-Zionist. But because the ultra-Orthodox world, the Haredi world, have taken an anti-Zionist stand, the Rebbe, whatever Rebbe it is, whether it's the Satmar Rebbe or the Belzer Rebbe or the Gera Rebbe or the whatever Rebbe, says that the state of Israel is a bad thing. then the Haredim go along with their Rebbe, and that's fine. They're entitled to do that. In terms of fact, my guess is that the vast majority of Haredim do not know why they are anti-Zionist. They're anti-Zionist because they will tell you they're anti-Zionist because the Zionists are not religious. That's not a reason not to be Zionist when you say, you know, what Zionism means, which is where we started, which is a homeland for the Jews. They have to say, if you push them and say, why do you not accept that the Jewish people should come and live in Israel and have sovereignty over the land in a state of Israel? They will be, if you push them, they will have to say, because we have to wait for Mashiach. Now, what they don't realize is why they have to wait for Mashiach, which is based on the 3 oaths, and was based on that Gemara in Ksubot. So the answer to your question, Sharon, really is yes and no. I think they don't really know that, yes, they are all anti-Zionist, the Haredi world, or the vast majority are, but no, I don't think they really understand why. That's my view.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, we've well run over time today. I hope that's been
thank you.
If there are any comments you want to make, feel free to email me or WhatsApp me. Happy for any follow-up suggestions for any lectures or talks. You can contact me or Avril, and watch this space for Tchelet. We are hoping that Tchelet's really going to take a step forward in the next few months. We've got lots of plans for exciting programs, which hopefully you'll all join in with. So I wish you a Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov.
Thank you.
And Chag Sameach for later on in the week.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jonathan. Bye.
Thank you.